A lot of people within the community believe Luffy is far above the rest of his crew and by far the strongest member of the Straw Hats, though this is currently the case as I've gone over in a recent video of mine. This wasn't always how it was. Today we will be talking about how Luffy's right hand deals with Luffy himself within every single arc of One Piece. Me and Arrow did this a while back with Zoro and Sanji, but this time I'm going to be doing it with Luffy and Zoro. I'll try to simultaneously go over both character scaling within the arcs, so bear with me as there are arcs where either one Straw Hat does nothing or isn't even actually present. So for those who are wondering who wins between Marineford Zoro and Marineford Luffy, or Whole Cake Zoro and Whole Cake Luffy, I can't answer that for you, sorry. With all that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and let me know what other characters you'd like to see this type of format with. Now, starting off in the East Blue Saga, I think it's clear that Luffy and Zoro for the most part are just evenly matched. In the beginning of the series, we see Zoro saving him from a lethal blow from Axe Hand Morgan, while Luffy would go on to display his strength as a leader by taking down Krieg and Arlong, two pillars of the East Blue. Now, Zoro loses to Arlong, so technically Arlong Park Luffy would be stronger than Arlong Park Zoro, but we have to remember that Zoro himself specifically was weakened in that arc. And before you guys comment down below how the Straw Hats get stronger every arc, this doesn't really change the scaling in any way, as Luffy and Zoro are all in the same arcs. So although Zoro would be technically weaker in this arc, Luffy and Zoro at their peaks in Arlong Park would probably just have a similar fight to what they had in Whiskey Peak. Unless you want to say Zoro in Syrup Village is weaker than Luffy because he didn't fight Kuro, but is stronger than Luffy in Baratie because he survived Mihawk's attack, I guess you can say that, but I really think this line of scaling is weird, and it is generally more consistent that Luffy and Zoro peak for peak, at least early East Blue, are just relative. That's just pretty much how it is going into Alabasta. And even in arcs like Drum Island, I think the result would just be ultimately the same, since we know Luffy during that arc did push his physical limits by climbing the mountain to save Nami, while Zoro in Drum Island is actively training pretty much throughout the whole arc. Now, in the Alabasta arc, we see that the hierarchy does change as Luffy is put up against Crocodile while Zoro is up against Crocodile's right-hand man. Crocodile is just straight up confirmed to be stronger than Mr. One, and we see Luffy throughout his fight with Crocodile actively grow way more powerful and end up surpassing him, while Zoro would enter a new realm of power himself similar to Luffy, but he would only just be enough to take out Mr. One. Now, I do think this Zoro could definitely damage Crocodile, and even Luffy would have to surpass his limits in order to beat down Mr. One, but due to Crocodile just straight up being confirmed stronger than Mr. One, Luffy would have to be stronger than Zoro by this point. And we know this stays consistent throughout the next few arcs, as Zoro pretty much post Alabasta is trying to reach that same level he did against Mr. One, whereas Luffy would just be simply growing much more powerful as he is up against threats like Enel. And even despite Zoro's bad performance against Enel, Enel is still impressed with Zoro, and even Luffy is shocked to see someone like Zoro go down. Regardless of what you think of Zoro scaling in Skypiea, Luffy should just be a good bit above him. Now, we do see in the next arc that Zoro grows a lot more powerful, and going into Water 7, it seems that Luffy and Zoro once again are portrayed to be relative. However, there is one problem for Zoro, and that is Luffy's gears. You see, Zoro at best has a temporary transformation that maybe makes him like 3 times stronger. We don't actually know the amp of Asura. However, we do know based on what's implied by Bluno that Gear 2 is pretty much the 10 steps of Soru being pumped up in his whole system, meaning at the very least he should be 10 times faster, which even some guides confirm this to be. Granted, the gear transformations are a little inconsistent, but I definitely think it's a lot more optimal in combat than Asura. So even just looking at their power-ups and not even noting the increased strength of both characters, which mind you, even base Luffy is capable of harming transformed Lucci, who should be above transformed Kaku, meaning at the very worst, Luffy is fighting somebody that's nearly 2 times stronger than Zoro's opponent. Now, I definitely think Zoro is a lot stronger than Kaku. He's able to literally turn his attack into mist, but the fact that Luffy is even able to put Lucci down, and the Viver cards even confirm that this version of Zoro is second to Luffy in power, it would mean ultimately Luffy with Gear 2 and 3 would be able to put Zoro down. And And although in Enies lobby, Luffy does put a gap between him and his right-hand man, we'd see Zoro not only get a new sword in the next arc, but we see him actively being compared to this new version of Luffy, if not straight up surpassing him. You see, in Thriller Bark, after fighting Ryuma and taking his sword, despite not really being used to its heavy weight, he's able to deflect the attacks and even damage Oars, who mind you is using Luffy's shadow, so even to a degree, yes, this guy does scale to Luffy. And mind you, we see Shadow Luffy, who is just an amped version of Luffy not being able to put him down, and we know that an amped Moria is ultimately stronger than Oars, and we see that Luffy with gear 2 and 3 is just enough to beat him down. However, after going through the tomfoolery of this arc, he just simply pass out, while the other Straw Hats would have to deal with the other warlord on the island who was already portrayed to be relative to Moria, that being Kuma. And of course, as we know based on Kuma's scaling in Sabaody, Kuma should be a stronger opponent than Moria. And despite this, a weakened Zoro is able to perform very well against him, dodging some of his fastest attacks and even landing a significant blow on him. Zoro was huffing and puffing going into the fight, and he put down a stronger warlord than the one that Luffy did. And after he pretty much runs out the remnants of stamina he barely had left, he then goes on to take all of Luffy's pain that he endured in that arc and survive. I need you guys to understand just how ridiculous this is. This would mean everything that Luffy took in this arc, Zoro, while weakened, was able to survive. And I know a lot of you are going to bring this up in the comments, which I'm just going to debunk these stupid theories. We don't know if Zoro quote-unquote died and came back to life and got revived. None of it is really true. All we know is that Zoro got hit by this and walked out of it just barely. So until we get some confirmed info about that, we can go under the presumption that Zoro just simply survived the attack because that was what Kuma wanted him to do. This to me should show that Zoro at his peak is capable of withstanding anything Luffy's got and more, and I think Sabaody displays this even further. You see, technically in this arc, Zoro would be weakened by his injuries, so Luffy would be stronger, but even despite this, I still think it's a very close fight since he is portraying relativity to Luffy's strongest forms while he's literally aching, and then he uses Asura to pretty much set up Gear 3 to put down the Pacifista. And if I'm being honest, the only ones who did any real damage in this Wombo combo is probably just the big three. I think Luffy in the Sabaody arc, of course, should win since he dealt the finishing blow against the Pacifista, but the fact that a weakened Zoro can put up a fight with Luffy is kind of funny. And if Zoro wasn't weakened in this arc, I honestly think he'd beat Luffy 6 times out of 10. So by the end of pre-time skip and going into post-time skip, it should be clear that Zoro is a good bit above his captain. Now, some of you may argue that Luffy could close the gap by the end of pre-time skip based on him experiencing Impel Down and Marineford. But if we're being honest, I really don't think it changes Luffy's scaling at all, unless you want to just say that Luffy scales to Mihawk, which, sure, bro. But realistically, Luffy shouldn't really be that much, if at all, stronger, just because he sacrificed years of his life to even just continue battling in Marineford, and he was just getting bullied the whole time. And so I would say before going into the 2.5-year time skip, Zoro is stronger, but after the two learned the basic usage of Haki, along with Luffy gaining another gear transformation, it sadly widened the gap once again. We have Viver cards just straight up confirming Zoro is just the second strongest in the Straw Hat crew, along with SBS stuff with Oda. And this is stuff pretty much going into Wano, so for the most part in post-time skip, Zoro is just a little bit below Luffy. We know this since the octopus that Luffy tries to hit in Gear 2 doesn't really get hurt in base, and Zoro would casually slam a way more powerful version of this guy. So this should prove that Zoro would at least give Luffy a fight, especially since he's more efficient in armament Haki. So to say that Zoro wouldn't even be able to hurt Luffy is kind of silly. But similar to what Enies lobby did, Dressrosa just kind of confirmed that Luffy's just way stronger than everybody since he beats Doflamingo. Not only was it emphasized throughout the Dressrosa arc that only Luffy could do this, meaning he was more than likely the strongest person there of the active people trying to stop Doffy, which would include Zoro. But again, with Gear 4, it just makes things not fair since Zoro's best scaling is to Gear 2 and 3, which Gear 4 is just a faster and stronger version of. Luffy, even after Doffy awakened his fruit, was still able to beat the bricks out of him with a few hits, while Zoro's best feat is cutting pica. And of course in Whole Cake, because of Luffy's Haki bloom against Katatkuri, the gap just gets way worse, man. Luffy would go from needing Gear 4 to draw blood from Katatkuri to now being able to do this in base, meaning probably base Whole Cake Luffy would slam Dressrosa Zoro pretty sadly. But luckily in Wano, once again, Zoro does manage to close the gap to a degree. While Luffy would discover Advanced Haki, Zoro would try to utilize the power of Odin's weapon, that being Enma. A blade that emits Advanced Haki as well, but it's hard for Zoro to control, and by the time he'd go into Onigashima, we'd see him being able to harness this power, but it's still hard for him to control, and yet despite this, he'd not only threaten to damage Kaido, but even succeeding in doing so after taking a combined attack from Big Mom and Kaido. Mind you, Luffy and Co were pretty much gonna be cooked from this if Zoro did not step in. Zoro's simple sword strikes and him with Asura was a threat to Kaido and could actually overwhelm him. This to me should at the very least put Zoro superior to the initial rooftop Luffy, but of course as we know he'd enter that Yonko realm of power when he's tapping into Advanced Conquerors against Kaido. This would allow him to once again power creep his right hand, as now he can be in extended battle with the guy he just barely scarred. But of course Zoro's streak doesn't end here, as he too would discover Advanced Conquerors and would still never really recover to 100% by the end of the arc, so he could be even stronger than what he's shown. I think Zoro at his peak though should be in the tier of the initial Luffy that was fighting Kaido that was tapping into Advanced Conquerors, but as we know, Kaido and Luffy actively grow in their battle, and sadly, Luffy would get another gear transformation. Come on, bro. This would force Kaido to use his strongest attacks, and even despite this, Luffy is able to bring him down, and really he's the only one capable of doing that. I know these Zoro over Kaido fanboys are going to be crying over this, but sadly he just would not be able to do that. And in Egghead we'd see this further shown, since Zoro is dealing with an opponent Luffy had a much easier time with, but to be fair, Zoro himself isn't going all out. But I think this does show that the second in command effect is still apparent, and Luffy currently is stronger, since Lucci's mentality was, oh, I can't beat the captain, so I'm just going to beat the right hand. And Zoro, whether you like it or not, does kind of struggle with Lucci a little bit. But again, this is not the same Zoro from the Wano arc, and if that Zoro fought Lucci, he would have just cooked him. I hope this video gave respect to both characters, mainly Zoro, since people just assume Luffy's always stronger, but that really wasn't always the case in the series.